This disabled 3-year-old was left for dead by his father at the bus stop. But when the city's most ruthless mafia boss, Weston, spotted the boy's worn teddy bear, he froze. The bear was the only link to Genevieve, the woman who vanished 20 years ago, forcing him to choose between his deadly empire and fatherhood. What unbelievable secret does this abandoned child hold about the boss's past that makes him risk everything to claim him? A young boy sat motionless on a cold metal bench at the city's main bus terminal at 6:15 p.m. on November 12th. His small fingers clutching a worn black teddy bear as passengers rushed past without a single glance. The temperature outside had dropped to 28 degrees, and the wind carried the smell of diesel exhaust and street vendor pretzels through the automatic doors that hissed open every 30 seconds. Jax's left foot was encased in an orthopedic club foot brace that scraped against the concrete floor with each involuntary shift of position, creating small metallic sounds that echoed under the departure announcements overhead. His black curly hair fell in messy spirals across his forehead, unwashed for days, and his brown eyes tracked each departing bus with mechanical precision, counting the seconds between arrivals, 14, 15, 16, as if the rhythm might summon his father back. The massive digital clock above the ticket counters showed 18:15, its red LED numbers flickering with each minute change, casting a faint crimson glow across the boy's green shirt with its black horizontal stripes. Around him, the terminal thrummed with life, commuters shouting into phones, families dragging rolling suitcases, food vendors closing their carts with metallic clangs that made him flinch. His father had left him here at 2 p.m. when weak afternoon light still streamed through the eastern windows, and the terminal smelled of coffee and fresh pastries instead of floor cleaner and exhaust fumes. The promise had been simple, direct, impossible to misunderstand. "Stay right here, buddy. Daddy's getting our tickets. Then we're going somewhere better." Those words now felt like smoke, impossible to hold, impossible to believe, but still clinging to his mind like the smell of his father's cheap aftershave. But what he didn't know was that someone was watching. Jax pressed the black teddy bear against his chest, feeling the worn fabric where the stuffing had compressed from years of anxious squeezing. The bear's button eyes were dull and scratched, and its black fur had faded to charcoal gray in patches. But it was the only constant thing in his 6 years of existence. The only thing that had been with him through every eviction, every late-night argument, every morning his father couldn't get out of bed. A janitor pushed a mop past the bench, the chemical smell of industrial cleaner mixing with the boy's growing fear and the distant scent of grease from the food court. But the man's eyes slid over Jax like he was part of the furniture, a fixture as permanent and unworthy of notice as the bolted-down benches themselves. The terminal's PA system crackled overhead, announcing departures to Philadelphia, Baltimore, Richmond, cities that meant nothing to a child who'd never left the neighborhood where his mother had died giving birth to him. A fact he'd overheard in his father's drunken confessions to empty bottles. His stomach cramped with hunger, reminding him that breakfast had been a single piece of toast his father had burned black on one side. Lunch had been forgotten entirely, lost somewhere between the landlord's final warning and the desperate drive to the terminal with everything they owned crammed into 2 garbage bags that his father had shoved under a bench before walking away. Jax's small voice whispered to the bear, practicing the words his father had taught him to say if anyone asked questions. "My name is Jax. I'm 6. My daddy's coming back with tickets." But even at 6, some part of him understood the difference between truth and desperate fiction, between promises and lies wrapped in a father's shame. Something didn't add up, and the truth was darker than he expected. Hello, if this story touches your heart even a little, go ahead and subscribe. Join our family of hope and love, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Let's share this journey together. The crowd thinned as the evening deepened, families finding their buses, commuters catching their connections home, until the cavernous terminal felt vast and cold, despite the heating vents that rumbled and clicked overhead. Shadows stretched longer across the scuffed linoleum floor, and Jax's legs began to ache from sitting so still, but terror kept him frozen exactly where his father had placed him, as if moving even an inch might break whatever invisible thread could bring his father back. A security guard strolled past, his radio crackling with static and incomprehensible codes, his flashlight beam sweeping across the bench without pausing. Jax held his breath, some survival instinct telling him that drawing attention might make everything worse, might summon social workers or police, or anyone who could make his father disappear permanently into a system he didn't understand but had learned to fear from his father's bitter warnings. The terminal's food vendors began pulling down their metal shutters, each one clanging shut like a door closing on possibility. A coffee cart worker dumped the last of his brew into a drain, the rich aroma briefly masking the smell of floor wax and human exhaustion that permeated the stale air. Jax's fingers traced the seam along the teddy bear's belly, following the uneven stitching his grandmother had sewn before she died. The last person besides his father who'd ever cared whether he existed. The bear was the only thing he owned that connected him to someone who'd loved him unconditionally, making it more valuable than food or warmth, or even the father who'd vanished into the anonymous crowd. There was one detail everyone missed. His small body shivered as the temperature dropped further. The terminal's automatic doors opened and closed with each arriving passenger, letting in blasts of November air that smelled of car exhaust and approaching rain. The thin windbreaker he wore had a broken zipper that wouldn't close past his chest, and his blue shorts offered no protection against the cold metal bench. His red knee-high socks had holes at the heels. Inadequate armor against a November evening that promised frost by midnight. The departure board cycled through destinations with electronic beeps. Newark, Boston, New Haven, each one a place Jax would never see, adventures he'd never have, a future that seemed to narrow with each passing minute like a tunnel collapsing from both ends. His brown eyes grew heavy, exhaustion warring with the fear that if he slept, he might miss his father's return. Or worse, wake up in a police station or foster home, the nightmare scenarios his father had described in vivid detail during their worst nights. A woman in a navy business suit walked past, her heels clicking sharp staccato rhythms on the linoleum, her phone pressed to her ear as she complained about delayed routes and incompetent drivers. She came within 2 feet of Jax's bench, her perfume momentarily overwhelming the industrial cleaning smells. But her eyes never dropped from their horizontal sightline to notice the small figure hunched below. Jax shifted on the bench, his clubfoot brace scraping against the floor with a sound he'd learned to hate. The sound that drew stares and whispers and sometimes cruel laughter from other children who didn't understand what it meant to be born wrong. The cold metal pressed against his skin through his thin shorts, a constant reminder of the surgery his father couldn't afford, and the physical therapy appointments they'd stopped attending 8 months ago when his father lost his second job. The massive digital clock's numbers flipped to 1815, and something in Jax's chest tightened like a fist closing around his heart. 4 hours and 15 minutes since his father had walked away, disappearing into the crowd with slumped shoulders and the smell of cheap whiskey following him like a shadow he couldn't outrun. That moment, everything in the room changed. At precisely 6:15 p.m., a man in a black wool overcoat entered the bus terminal through the west entrance, his presence creating an invisible ripple through the crowd like a stone dropped into still water. Conversations died mid-sentence as people turned away, suddenly finding urgent business in opposite directions. Their survival instincts recognizing danger even when their conscious minds couldn't name it, couldn't articulate why the air itself seemed to change density when he walked through it. Weston moved through the terminal with the unhurried grace of someone who'd never had to rush for anything, his Italian leather shoes making almost no sound on the linoleum despite their solid construction. The overcoat hung perfectly from his broad shoulders, custom-tailored to conceal the weapon he carried and emphasize the athletic build beneath, while a charcoal scarf wrapped once around his neck suggested wealth without ostentation. Money that didn't need to announce itself because everyone already knew. His Range Rover had died 3 blocks from the terminal. Something about the transmission that his driver couldn't fix with the tools on hand. The decision to continue on foot and take a taxi had been unusual, irritating. Weston hadn't used public transportation in 12 years, not since he'd risen from enforcer to the man who gave the orders that made entire neighborhoods bend to his will. He couldn't explain why, but danger was closing in. The terminal's usual evening energy felt muted, as if someone had turned down the volume on human activity whenever he passed through. A transit police officer near the information booth suddenly remembered paperwork that needed immediate attention elsewhere. A group of teenagers who'd been loitering near the vending machines scattered like startled pigeons before a predator they couldn't see but instinctively feared. Weston's destination was the taxi stand on the terminal's north side, a simple journey that should have taken 4 minutes through the main concourse. His mind was occupied with the meeting he'd just left. A negotiation over territory that had gone smoothly because everyone at the table knew the cost of making it go otherwise, knew what happened to men who mistook his patience for weakness. Then his peripheral vision caught something that made his forward momentum halt completely. A child sat alone on a bench, illuminated by harsh fluorescent lights that made his curly black hair look almost blue-black in the artificial glow. But it wasn't the solitude that stopped Weston's breath. Children got separated from parents in terminals constantly. It was the natural chaos of public spaces. It was the black teddy bear clutched in those small arms. Its fur faded to charcoal gray in patches. Its button eyes dull and scratched from years of handling. But this wasn't even the most shocking part. Weston had seen that exact bear before, 23 years ago, when he'd given it to a woman whose name still tasted like copper and regret on particularly silent nights. Genevieve had laughed when he'd presented it, calling him sentimental for a man in his profession, teasing him that mob bosses weren't supposed to give teddy bears. And she'd promised to keep it forever as proof that he was more than the reputation that preceded him into rooms, more than the violence that kept his empire intact. 3 months later, she'd vanished without a trace, disappeared as if she'd never existed, leaving only questions and a grief so profound he'd buried it under concrete and steel, and the bodies of men who'd dared to suggest she'd left him willingly. And now, impossibly, that bear, her bear, was here. Clutched in the hands of a disabled boy abandoned in a bus terminal, waiting for a father who was never coming back. He knew something that no one else in the building did. The hours stretched like pulled taffy, each minute dragging Jax deeper into a terror he had no words to describe. By 3:00 p.m., his left leg had begun to ache where the club foot brace pressed against his ankle bone, the cheap foam padding worn through from months of use. He'd learned not to adjust it too often. The scraping sound drew attention, and attention meant questions he'd been taught never to answer. By 4:00 p.m., the afternoon commuter rush had begun, and Jax pressed himself against the back of the bench, making himself as small as possible while businessmen in dark suits rushed past, their briefcases swinging dangerously close to his head. None of them looked down. None of them saw the boy with the black teddy bear whose fingers had gone white from gripping so hard. By 5:00 p.m., his stomach had stopped cramping and started burning, a hollow feeling that made him dizzy when he turned his head too quickly. He thought about the vending machines 20 feet away, their bright lights advertising candy bars and chips, but his father had taken all the money. Even the quarters Jax had been collecting in a jar were gone, spent on gas for the desperate drive that had ended here. By 5:30 p.m., he needed to use the bathroom so badly his eyes watered. But terror kept him frozen. His father's last words before disappearing had been explicit. "Don't move. Don't talk to anyone. Stay exactly here." And Jax had learned over 6 brutal years that disobeying his father's orders, even when his father was drunk, even when his father was wrong, always made everything worse. So he sat, and he waited, and he pressed his thighs together against the pressure building in his bladder, and he whispered to the black teddy bear about how his daddy was just getting tickets, how they were going somewhere better, how everything would be fine once his daddy came back. One wrong move, and everything would fall apart. By 6 o'clock p.m., the terminal had begun its evening transformation. The fluorescent lights seemed harsher, casting shadows that made the cavernous space feel more like a cave than a building. The cleaning crews emerged with their industrial mops and yellow caution signs, and Jax watched them work, his brown eyes tracking their movements with the desperate hope that maybe one of them would notice him, would ask if he was okay, would somehow fix whatever had broken in his life. But they didn't. Their eyes slid over him like he was part of the architecture, invisible as the bolted-down benches or the scuffed linoleum, or the departure board that kept cycling through cities he'd never see. The physical pain had become constant now. His leg throbbed where the brace dug into skin that had developed permanent indentations from years of pressure. His back ached from sitting so rigidly still. His throat was so dry he could barely swallow, and when he tried to wet his lips, his tongue felt like sandpaper against chapped skin. But worse than the physical pain was the certainty growing in his chest like a cold stone. The understanding that his father wasn't coming back, that the promise had been a lie, that he'd been left here the same way people left garbage bags at the curb on collection day. Jax had overheard enough late-night arguments to understand his father's situation in fragments. Debt collectors who called at all hours, men with hard voices who'd showed up at their apartment making threats, eviction notices that piled up on the kitchen counter like accusatory white rectangles. His father's hands had shaken when he'd driven to the terminal, and his breath had smelled like the whiskey he kept under the bathroom sink, and his voice had cracked when he'd said, "Stay right here, buddy." Now Jax understood. His father hadn't been getting tickets. His father had been running, from debt, from responsibility, from a disabled son who cost too much money and required too much care, and served as a constant reminder of the wife who'd died bringing him into the world. What followed next was completely unexpected. By 7 p.m., Jax had stopped practicing the lie his father had taught him. The words tasted wrong in his mouth, bitter as the medicine his father used to give him before they'd stopped going to the doctor. Instead, he sat in silence, clutching the black teddy bear his grandmother had given him before she died. The bear whose button eyes seemed to understand what no human would acknowledge. By 7:30 p.m., the terminal had emptied considerably. The evening rush was over, and only scattered travelers remained. A few homeless people sleeping on distant benches, a couple arguing in hushed tones near the ticket counter, a janitor methodically mopping the same section of floor he'd already cleaned twice. Jax's small body had begun to shiver uncontrollably, not just from cold, but from exhaustion and hunger and fear that had accumulated over 4.5 hours until it felt like a physical weight pressing down on his chest. His vision had started to blur at the edges, and he couldn't tell if it was from crying or from the way the fluorescent lights seemed to pulse and dim in rhythm with his heartbeat. The clubfoot brace had rubbed a raw spot on his ankle that stung every time he shifted position. He could feel wetness there, either blood or lymph fluid, seeping through his red sock. But he didn't dare remove the brace to check. His father had told him never to take it off in public, had warned him that people would stare, would say cruel things, would see him as broken and wrong and less than human. By 7:45 p.m., Jax had given up on his father's return, but hadn't yet accepted what would happen next. The thought of approaching an adult terrified him more than staying on the bench. His father had filled his head with stories of foster homes where children were beaten and starved, of social workers who separated siblings and locked kids in closets, of a system designed to chew up boys like him and spit them out even more damaged than they'd started. So he sat, and he waited, and he clutched his black teddy bear, and he tried not to think about how badly he needed a bathroom or food or water or someone, anyone, to tell him what to do next. The digital clock above the departure board flipped to 7:55 p.m., and Jax closed his eyes against the tears that had been threatening for hours. He was so tired, so scared, so completely and utterly alone in a way that no 6-year-old should ever have to understand. And then the air in the terminal changed. From here on, the rules of the game changed. Jax felt it before he saw it. A shift in pressure. A sudden silence that fell over the scattered travelers like a blanket dropped over a birdcage. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Footsteps faltered and changed direction. Even the janitor's mop stopped its rhythmic swishing against the linoleum. Jax opened his eyes and turned his head toward the west entrance, following the direction of everyone else's sudden, fearful attention. A man in a black wool overcoat had just walked through the automatic doors. And though Jax was only 6 and understood little about the world's hierarchies and dangers, even he could sense that this man was different. This man was dangerous. This man made grown-ups afraid. The man moved through the terminal like he owned it, his expensive shoes making almost no sound, his presence creating an invisible bubble that people instinctively avoided. A transit cop near the information booth suddenly found urgent business in the opposite direction. A group of teenagers scattered like leaves before wind. And Jax, exhausted and terrified and still clutching his black teddy bear, watched this dangerous man walk past his bench without so much as a glance, heading toward the north exit and the taxi stand beyond. The man who would change everything was already walking away, and Jax didn't even know enough to call out for help. He should have walked away, but then he saw it. Weston's mind was occupied with numbers and territories, with the meeting he'd just concluded, and the subtle threats he'd delivered with perfect civility. Marcus Chen had agreed to the new distribution boundaries with minimal negotiation, which meant either Chen was smart enough to recognize reality or stupid enough to think he could renege later. Weston would know which within a week. The terminal's north exit was 30 feet ahead when something in his peripheral vision caught his attention. Not a threat, not movement exactly, but a flash of color that didn't belong in the muted grays and blacks of evening travelers. Green with black stripes. Red socks. A small figure hunched on a bench. Weston's training told him to keep walking. Children weren't his concern. The terminal had security, had social services, had systems in place for exactly this sort of situation. He had a car to catch, business to conduct, an empire to maintain. But something made him slow his stride. Some instinct that had kept him alive through 2 decades of bloodshed and betrayal whispered that this moment mattered, that walking past would be a mistake he couldn't take back. He stopped walking entirely, his Italian leather shoes silent on the linoleum, and turned his head to look directly at the bench he'd just passed. The boy was small, perhaps 6 or 7, with black curly hair that needed washing and brown eyes that tracked Weston's movement with the wariness of an animal that had learned to expect pain. He wore a green shirt with black horizontal stripes, blue shorts despite the November cold, and red knee-high socks that drew the eye down too. Weston's breath caught in his throat. The left leg ended in an orthopedic brace, the kind used for severe clubfoot deformity. The brace's metal gleamed dully under the fluorescent lights, and even from 10 feet away, Weston could see the raw skin visible above the boy's sock line. But it wasn't the disability that made Weston's world tilt on its axis. It was what the boy held, clutched against his chest with white-knuckled desperation. A black teddy bear. In that moment, the entire balance of power flipped. Weston's vision narrowed to a tunnel, everything else in the terminal fading to peripheral noise as his focus locked onto that toy with absolute, devastating certainty. The bear's fur was faded to charcoal gray in patches. Its button eyes were dull and scratched. One ear was slightly misshapen, as if it had been sewn back on after being torn loose. Weston had given that exact bear to Genevieve on her 23rd birthday, 23 years ago, in the small apartment they'd shared before he'd risen to power and she'd vanished into smoke. He'd bought it at a street fair, from a vendor who specialized in handmade toys, and he'd felt ridiculous carrying it through the streets. A young enforcer with blood on his hands and a teddy bear under his arm. But Genevieve had wanted it, had pointed at it and laughed and said it looked like it had survived a war, like it understood what surviving meant. "It's perfect," she'd said when he'd given it to her, pressing her face into its black fur. It survived, and it's still soft. Like you. He'd told her she was insane, that he was the opposite of soft. That men in his profession didn't get compared to teddy bears. She'd kissed him and promised to keep it forever, to think of him every time she looked at it, to remember that underneath the violence and the reputation, he was still capable of gestures that had nothing to do with power or fear. 3 months later, she'd disappeared. No note, no warning, no body ever found. Just gone, as if she'd never existed, leaving him with questions that had slowly calcified into the scar tissue that let him function without feeling, lead without caring, kill without hesitation. And now that bear, her bear, the one he'd searched for in her abandoned apartment and never found, was here, 23 years later, in the hands of a disabled boy abandoned in a bus terminal. Hidden in the files was a secret that could destroy them all. The impossibility of it made Weston's carefully constructed control fracture. His feet moved without conscious decision, carrying him the 10 steps back to the bench where the boy sat hunched and shivering. His security training screamed at him to maintain distance, to never show interest, to never reveal what mattered. But something older than training, something primal and wounded and desperate for answers, overrode every calculated instinct he'd developed over 20 years of survival. Weston knelt down on one knee directly in front of the bench, bringing his face level with the boy's, destroying his own rule about never showing vulnerability in public spaces, never putting himself at eye level with anyone, never revealing that anything in the world had the power to stop him in his tracks. The boy's brown eyes went wide with fear, and his small body pressed back against the bench as if he could disappear into the metal. His fingers tightened on the black teddy bear, and a small sound escaped his throat. Not quite a whimper, but close. "Where did you get that bear?" Weston's voice came out rough, scraped raw by a grief he'd thought he'd buried deep enough to never surface again. The boy didn't answer, just stared at him with eyes that held too much knowledge for someone so young. Eyes that recognized danger when it knelt in front of them wearing an expensive overcoat and asking questions about toys. Weston forced himself to breathe, to gentle his tone, to remember that this child wasn't responsible for whatever impossible connection existed between a teddy bear and a woman who'd vanished before this boy was even born. "I'm not going to hurt you," Weston said. Though he knew the words meant nothing. Dangerous men always said they weren't going to hurt you right before they did. "I just need to know about the bear. Where did you get it?" The boy's lips trembled, and when he finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. "My grandma gave it to me, before she died." "Your grandmother." Weston's mind raced through possibilities, through timelines that didn't make sense, through connections that couldn't exist but apparently did. "What was your grandmother's name?" "I don't know." The boy's eyes filled with tears. "I don't remember. I was really little." "What about your mother?" Weston pressed, aware that he was frightening the child, unable to stop himself from needing answers more than he needed to maintain his carefully cultivated distance. "What was your mother's name?" "I don't have a mom," the boy whispered. "She died when I was born." But the real question was, who planned it? The terminal noise faded to white static in Weston's ears. The world reduced itself to this bench, this boy, this bear that shouldn't exist. Genevieve had disappeared 23 years ago. This boy was approximately 6 years old. The math was impossible, the timeline wrong, but the bear, was undeniable proof that some connection existed, some thread that linked his buried past to this abandoned present. Weston reached out slowly, giving the boy time to flinch away, and touched the teddy bear's worn fur with fingers that had killed men without hesitation, but now trembled like he was touching something holy. The fabric felt exactly as he remembered it, soft despite its age, worn smooth by years of being held. The black fur faded to gray in the exact same patterns he'd memorized during the desperate months after Genevieve's disappearance, when he'd searched every pawnshop and secondhand store in the city looking for any trace of her. "What's your name?" Weston asked, his voice coming out gentler than he'd used in years. The tone he reserved for no one, because everyone in his life understood he was dangerous, and treating him otherwise was suicide. "Jax," the boy whispered. "Jax." Weston tested the name, found it lacking in any connection to Genevieve, but filed it away anyway. "Where's your father, Jax?" The boy's face crumpled, and fresh tears spilled down his cheeks, leaving clean tracks through dirt Weston hadn't noticed in his focus on the bear. "He said he was getting tickets. But he's not coming back." The certainty in that small voice broke something in Weston's chest that he'd thought was permanently sealed. This choice would define the rest of his life. This boy had been abandoned, left here like garbage, left with a disability that required expensive care, and a teddy bear that connected him to a woman who'd vanished and a man who'd spent 23 years trying to forget what love felt like before it was ripped away. Weston made a decision in that moment that had nothing to do with logic or territory or the empire he'd built on violence and fear. He knelt in front of a disabled boy in a public bus terminal, destroyed every rule he'd ever made about emotional distance, and let himself acknowledge what his gut had known from the first moment he'd seen that black teddy bear. This child was his responsibility now, not because of debt or obligation or strategy, but because that bear had survived 23 years to end up in this boy's arms. And Weston didn't believe in coincidence. He believed in fate, in connections that transcended logic, in debts that had to be paid even when you didn't understand why. He'd failed to protect Genevieve. He wouldn't fail to protect whatever fragment of her had led him to this bench tonight. He wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting for family. Weston stayed kneeling in front of the bench, his expensive overcoat collecting dust from the terminal floor, his reputation bleeding away with every second he spent at eye level with an abandoned child. Somewhere in the back of his mind, his training screamed at him about exposure, about witnesses, about maintaining the facade that made men fear him. He ignored all of it. "How long have you been sitting here, Jax?" Weston kept his voice low, controlled, the tone he used when extracting information from people who wanted to lie but knew better. "Since 2 o'clock. The boy's voice cracked on the words. He said, "Stay here." He said, "Don't move." 4.5 hours. This child had been abandoned for 4.5 hours in a bus terminal, disabled and vulnerable, while Weston had been across town negotiating territory with men whose lives meant nothing. "Are you hungry?" Weston asked, though he already knew the answer from the hollow look in the boy's eyes and the way his free hand pressed against his stomach. Jax nodded, not trusting his voice, new tears tracking down his cheeks. "When did you last eat?" "Breakfast." The word came out small, ashamed, as if admitting hunger was a weakness. "Toast, but it was burned." Weston's jaw tightened. Toast, burned toast, 8 hours ago. For a child who looked like he hadn't had a decent meal in weeks, whose clothes hung loose on a frame that should have been growing but was clearly malnourished. "Do you need to use the bathroom?" The boy's face flushed red, and he nodded miserably, his small body tensing as if expecting punishment for having basic human needs. Something dangerous and protective coiled in Weston's chest, the same instinct that had made him lethal in his profession, but redirected now toward a target he couldn't name but understood with absolute clarity. Whoever had done this to this child would pay. "Okay." Weston made his voice gentle, though gentleness wasn't something he'd practiced in years. "Here's what's going to happen. I'm going to take you to the bathroom first, then we're going to get you some food, and then—" He paused, knowing what he was about to say would change everything, unable to stop himself from saying it anyway. "Then you're coming with me." Jax's brown eyes went wide, fear and hope warring in equal measure. "Where?" "Somewhere safe. Weston stood, his knees protesting the movement after kneeling on concrete, and held out his hand. Somewhere warm. Somewhere no one will hurt you or leave you. The boy stared at Weston's outstretched hand like it was a trap, and Weston couldn't blame him. Trust was a luxury this child clearly couldn't afford, had probably never been able to afford in his short, brutal life. "I know you don't know me," Weston said, keeping his hand extended, patient in a way he'd never been with adults who wasted his time. "But I promise you this. I'm not your father. I don't make promises I won't keep. And I'm not leaving you here." Something in Jax's face shifted. Not trust exactly, but the desperate, drowning person's instinct to grab whatever floated by, even if it might drag you under instead of keeping you afloat. He reached out with his free hand, the black teddy bear still clutched in his other, and placed his small palm in Weston's. Weston's fingers closed around the boy's hand, and he felt the trembling in that small frame, the way Jax's grip tightened like he was holding a lifeline he'd finally been thrown after drowning for hours. If you've ever felt abandoned or invisible like Jax, or if you believe broken people deserve a second chance at family, hit that subscribe button right now. This story is for everyone who's ever needed someone to keep their promises. Comment where you're watching from. Let's build this family together. "Can you stand?" Weston asked. Jax nodded and pushed himself off the bench, his club foot brace scraping against the concrete with a sound that made Weston's teeth ache in sympathy. The boy swayed slightly, either from exhaustion or hunger or fear, and Weston's other hand moved instinctively to steady him, gripping his thin shoulder. "Easy," Weston said. "We're not in a rush." They moved slowly across the terminal toward the bathrooms, Jax's limp pronounced, the brace forcing his left leg into an awkward gait that clearly caused pain with every step. Weston matched his pace to the boys, ignoring the stares from the few remaining travelers who recognized that something unusual was happening. That the man everyone avoided was now holding hands with a disabled child and moving with a gentleness that contradicted everything his reputation promised. When they reached the bathroom, Weston released Jax's hand. "I'll wait right here, right outside this door. I'm not going anywhere." Jax looked up at him with eyes that asked, "Really? And are you lying? And please don't be lying all at once." "I promise," Weston said, and meant it with the same absoluteness he'd meant every threat he'd ever delivered, every deal he'd ever closed, every protection he'd ever guaranteed. Jax disappeared into the bathroom, and Weston pulled out his phone, already scrolling through contacts. His mind racing through logistics and threats, and the immediate steps required to secure this situation. For the first time, he wasn't in control. He called Marcus first, his lieutenant, the man who'd been with him since the early days when they were both just muscle for hire instead of men who controlled territory. "I need you at the main bus terminal. West entrance, now." Weston's voice carried the tone that meant no questions, immediate compliance, drop everything. "Problem?" Marcus's voice came through sharp, instantly alert. "Situation." Weston never called anything a problem. Problems were things that might or might not be resolved. Situations were things that would be resolved, one way or another. "Bring the car to the west entrance, and call Juniper Reed." "The social worker?" Marcus's surprise bled through despite his training. "What?" "Now, Marcus." Weston ended the call. Juniper Reed was the person he called when situations required legal cover, when things needed to look legitimate on paper while being anything but legitimate in practice. She was a social worker who understood that sometimes the system failed children so completely that the only solution was to bypass it entirely, and she'd proven over the years that she could navigate that moral gray area without losing her conscience or her discretion. The bathroom door opened, and Jax emerged, looking somehow smaller and more vulnerable than before, his red socks damp from where he'd apparently tried to wash his hands in the sink and gotten water everywhere. Better? Weston asked. Jax nodded, reaching for Weston's hand again with an urgency that suggested he was afraid it wouldn't be offered twice. Weston took the small hand in his, feeling the bones too close to the surface, the skin too cold, the trembling that hadn't stopped since they'd first touched. Food next, Weston said, and led Jax toward the terminal's food court, which was mostly closed but still had one vendor selling pizza by the slice from under heat lamps that made everything look orange and unappetizing. But this wasn't the first time something like this had happened. Weston bought 3 slices, a bottle of water, and a carton of orange juice, ignoring the vendor's wide eyes when he recognized who was standing at his counter. He carried the food to a nearby table and set it down in front of Jax. "Eat slowly," Weston instructed. "Your stomach's going to be angry if you eat too fast." Jax attacked the first slice like he was afraid it would disappear, his small hands trembling as he shoved pizza into his mouth in bites too large to swallow easily. Weston watched him, committing every detail to memory, the desperate hunger, the way he kept looking up to make sure Weston was still there, the black teddy bear propped carefully on the table within reach. "What's your last name, Jax?" Weston asked when the boy had slowed down enough to breathe between bites. "Price," Jax mumbled through a mouthful of cheese. "Jax Price. And your father's name?" "Dustin." Something dark crossed Jax's face. Dustin Price. Weston committed the name to memory, already planning the search he'd have Marcus initiate within the hour. Dustin Price would be found. Dustin Price would understand exactly what happened to men who abandoned disabled children in bus terminals. But that was a problem for later. Right now, the priority was securing this child, making sure he didn't disappear into a system that would chew him up and spit him out even more damaged than he already was. Someone in the room was lying. But who? Marcus appeared at the edge of the food court, his expression carefully neutral, but his eyes communicating confusion and concern. Weston gave him a subtle nod. "Wait there," and Marcus took up position by the entrance, becoming a wall between Jax and whatever threats might exist. Jax finished the first slice and reached for the second with only slightly less desperation, his eyes tracking Weston's every movement, as if afraid he'd stand up and walk away. "I need to ask you something, Jax." Weston kept his voice level, non-threatening, though what he was about to ask was anything but casual. "Do you have any other family? Grandparents? Aunts? Uncles? Anyone who'd be looking for you?" Jax shook his head, swallowing a bite of pizza. "Just my dad, and he's not coming back." The certainty in that small voice was heartbreaking and convenient in equal measure. No family meant no one to fight custody, no one to question where this child went next, no one to care when Dustin Price disappeared and was never found. "Okay." Weston pulled out his phone again and sent a text to Marcus. "Juniper. 10 minutes. Conference room if terminal has one, otherwise car." Marcus's response came back immediately. "Security office. Arranged." Weston looked at Jax, who was halfway through the second slice but slowing down, his small body reaching its limit. "How's your leg feeling?" Jax glanced down at his brace, then back up at Weston. "It hurts. It always hurts." "We're going to fix that," Weston said, making another promise he had no legal right to make, no authority to keep, but would keep anyway through sheer force of will and unlimited resources. "How?" Jax's voice held hope that he was clearly afraid to give voice to. "I know people," Weston said, which was an understatement. He knew everyone, and everyone he knew understood that when Weston wanted something done, it got done, regardless of cost or difficulty, or the normal limitations that governed other people's lives. And suddenly, he realized he was being played. A woman in her mid-40s appeared at Marcus's side, wearing a professional pantsuit and carrying a leather bag that marked her as someone who navigated systems for a living. Juniper Reed had arrived. Marcus gestured toward Weston, and Juniper's eyes widened slightly when she saw him sitting at a table with a child. acting like he was someone's father instead of someone who made grown men disappear. "Jax," Weston said gently, "I need to talk to someone about making sure you're safe. Her name is Juniper, and she's going to help us. But I need you to stay here with my friend Marcus for just a few minutes while I talk to her. Can you do that?" Jax's hand shot out and grabbed Weston's sleeve, panic flooding his face. "You said you weren't leaving." "I'm not leaving," Weston said firmly, covering the small hand with his own. "I'm going to be right over there." He pointed to where Juniper stood, maybe 20 feet away. "And you can see me the whole time. Marcus will stay with you. He works for me. He's safe. And I will be back in 5 minutes. I promise." Jax's grip loosened slightly, though fear still radiated from his small frame. Weston stood, then did something that would have shocked anyone who knew him professionally. He removed his cashmere overcoat, the one that cost more than most people made in a month, and wrapped it around Jax's shoulders. "Hold on to this for me," Weston said. "I'll need it back when I come get you." The coat was enormous on the boy's small frame, pooling around him like a black tent, but it was warm, and it smelled expensive, and most importantly, it was physical proof that Weston would return. You didn't abandon a $3,000 coat with a child you were planning to leave. His next decision would decide whether he lived or died. Weston walked to where Juniper waited, leaving Marcus standing guard over Jax with instructions conveyed in a single look. "Protect him. With your life if necessary." "Weston." Juniper's voice carried professional calm that didn't quite hide her confusion. "Marcus said you needed emergency services. Is that—" She glanced at Jax. "Is that the situation?" "That's the situation," Weston confirmed. "Abandoned by his father approximately 4.5 hours ago. Disabled, malnourished, no other family, and not going into the system." Juniper's professional mask slipped for just a moment. "Weston, you can't just—" "I can," Weston interrupted, his voice dropping to the tone that made people remember who they were talking to. "And I will. Your job is to make it legal. Emergency placement. Foster care with me as the provider. Start adoption proceedings. Whatever paperwork makes this look legitimate. But that boy is not spending tonight in a group home or a system that will lose track of him before morning." "You're not a licensed foster provider," Juniper said, though her tone suggested she was already calculating workarounds. "Then make me one," Weston said flatly. "Emergency circumstances. Immediate danger. Child with special medical needs requiring specialized care. Whatever the language is that makes this happen tonight." Juniper looked at Jax, who was watching them while trying to eat his pizza, the black overcoat swallowing his small frame. "What's his name?" "Jax Price. 6 years old. Clubfoot requiring corrective surgery. Father's name is Dustin Price, and if you find him, you'll make sure he understands that parental rights have been permanently terminated." The way Weston said permanently terminated made clear he wasn't talking about legal paperwork, but he had no idea a bigger force was controlling everything. Juniper closed her eyes briefly, then opened them with the resigned expression of someone who'd crossed ethical lines before and would cross them again for the right reasons. "Give me an hour. I'll need to make calls. I'll need—" 30 minutes, Weston said. "And you'll have whatever you need. Money, access, documentation, whatever makes this legal on paper." "This is insane," Juniper said, but she was already pulling out her phone, already scrolling through contacts. "This is necessary," Weston corrected. He turned back toward the table where Jax sat watching them. Marcus standing guard like the soldier he'd once been, and Weston knew, with the same certainty he'd known when he'd first seen that black teddy bear, that his life had just changed in ways he couldn't predict but couldn't prevent. That boy was his now, not because of paperwork or law or any system that governed normal people's lives, but because some debts transcended time, And some promises were kept even when you didn't understand who you'd made them to. And sometimes fate handed you a second chance wrapped in tragedy and dared you to be strong enough to take it. Weston walked back to the table and sat down across from Jax, who immediately relaxed when Weston was within reach again. "You're coming home with me tonight," Weston said simply. "Juniper's going to make sure it's legal. Marcus is going to make sure you're safe. And I'm going to make sure you're never afraid like this again." Jax's brown eyes filled with tears, but this time they weren't tears of fear or hunger or abandonment. They were tears of relief so profound it hurt to witness. "Promise?" Jax whispered. "I promise," Weston said. And meant it. This was only the beginning of a much bigger war. Weston knelt on the cold, unforgiving marble of the terminal floor. His world narrowed down to the small, shivering figure before him. Jax's face was smeared with dust and tears, but his eyes, wide and blue, were fixed on Weston's. The air of the terminal, previously hostile, seemed to crackle with an intense, fragile heat. Weston took off his thick, tailored cashmere coat, its dark fabric smelling faintly of expensive leather and steel, and wrapped it gently around the boy's thin body. Jax flinched at the unexpected warmth, but burrowed into the expensive softness. A moment later, a quiet woman with sharp, kind eyes and a badge that identified her as Juniper arrived. She moved with the efficient grace of someone who deals with the worst of humanity daily. Weston began delegating, his voice resuming its usual low, commanding register. "We need a full medical evaluation immediately. Discreetly. No public reports. He will be taken to my residence until the court date is set." Juniper opened her mouth, likely to object to bypassing every single protocol, but Weston cut her off with a look that brokered no argument. He lifted Jax, who was light and fragile in his arms, careful to avoid jostling the orthopedic brace. As Weston turned to leave, Jax, eyes frantic, saw the bus moving outside, saw the doors closing, saw the world resuming its pace without him. He grabbed a handful of Weston's silk tie, the fabric slipping through his tiny, frantic fingers, and cried out, "You won't leave, will you? You're leaving too?" That raw, primal fear, the culmination of 8 hours of abandonment, shattered the last of Weston's control. He ignored the professional objections starting to form on Juniper's face. He pulled the boy close, burying his own face in Jax's black, curly hair. "I'm not leaving you," Weston stated, his voice thick with a new, terrifying emotion. "You're coming home with me." Her next words hit him harder than any bullet. Weston carried Jax, asleep and exhausted, out of the terminal and into the armored black sedan. The boy's face was pressed into the clean, smooth cashmere of the coat, his small body finally still. The black teddy bear, the impossible link to Genevieve, lay tucked safely between them. Back at the penthouse, the staff moved like ghosts. The primary guest suite, all glass, chrome, and sterile gray, was swiftly and silently transformed. Fresh linens, soft lighting, and a child-sized toothbrush appeared as if conjured. Weston carried Jax into the room himself, gently placing him in the center of the vast bed. He spent an hour simply watching the boy sleep, mesmerized by the rise and fall of his chest, the faint, uneven light catching the club foot brace. By 5 a.m., the first reports arrived from his security team. They had located the abandoning father, Dustin Price, an unstable figure deep in debt. More importantly, the medical records hinted at a correctable physical disability and an unusual truth. Jax wasn't just a child. A pediatric specialist note from months ago, dismissed by Price, suggested the boy showed prodigious mathematical ability, an intellect stifled only by neglect. Weston sat back in his leather chair, the cold, powerful man again, but the numbness was gone. This wasn't just an abandoned boy. This was a gift, a painful echo of his past and a chance at a future. He didn't realize this moment would come back to haunt him. Weston wasted no time. Before the city properly woke, he was on a secured line with Dr. Blair, the preeminent orthopedic surgeon in the state. His instructions were concise and commanding. I need you to look at a 3-year-old boy. Clubfoot, immediate surgery. Money is irrelevant. Time is. Clear your calendar. Dr. Blair, accustomed to Weston's absolute authority, complied. When Jax awoke, he was in a room bathed in unfamiliar golden light, surrounded by quiet luxury. The fear returned, but it was muted by the comforting presence of Weston, who sat nearby, not towering over him, but simply waiting. Jax asked for his father, and Weston, for the first time in decades, spoke an honest truth unburdened by self-preservation. Your father had to go away, Jax, but you are safe here. You're going to stay with me, and I promise you, no one will ever hurt you again. That promise, delivered by a man whose word was absolute law, settled the anxiety in the boy's eyes. Over the next few days, Weston arranged the medical appointments and began the formal adoption process. He hung up from a call with his chief counsel, the legal plan fully executed. He then called Dr. Blair one final time, the decision absolute. The final wall of his solitary life falling away. Prepare for the adoption papers, Weston stated, his voice devoid of doubt. He's mine. This single decision gave him the upper hand again. Jax's first corrective surgery was a success. Weston waited in the private wing's lounge, ignoring a major business call. The first time he had ever prioritized a personal crisis over his empire. He found himself thinking about Genevieve and the bear, the mystery of the boy's lineage a secondary concern to the fact of the boy himself. As Jax recovered at the penthouse, slightly groggy from medication, he became surprisingly talkative. Weston sat on the edge of the vast bed, listening more than he ever had in his life. Jax spoke about numbers, his favorite constants in a world of variables. Weston asked him why he cared about zero, the concept of nothing. Jax looked up at him, his brow furrowed in concentration. Zero means nothing bad happened yet, he explained, his voice soft with residual pain medication. It's like before mistakes, before people leave. It's the number where everything's still okay. Weston felt a cold, sharp pain. The boy saw the world in equations because the human element had failed him. He gently stroked Jax's forehead, finding an unfamiliar, protective stillness settle over his restless heart. He didn't want revenge. He needed it. Recovery began. Jax started physical therapy, the discomfort of the exercises mitigated by the promise of freedom from the orthopedic brace. Juniper became a regular, necessary presence. She handled the complexities of the social services system and, more surprisingly, managed to draw Weston into domesticity. She taught him which cartoon was Jax's favorite, and he found himself in the kitchen with her, measuring cereal and making school lunches. Two immensely powerful and disciplined adults brought low by the simple needs of a child. Their shared devotion to Jax created a bridge between them. Late one night, after putting Jax to bed, they stood by the penthouse window, looking out over the silent, controlled city. The silence stretched until Weston broke it, his voice barely a whisper. He told her about the black teddy bear. He told her about Genevieve, the lost love from 23 years ago. How the boy was a ghost of a life he never had. I've never told anyone that, he admitted, the vulnerability a raw wound. Juniper didn't offer platitudes. She simply reached out and took his hand, her gaze steady. He needs you, Weston. And maybe you needed him to show you that a man like you can still be whole. In that moment, the final, strongest wall of his emotional isolation crumbled, replaced by the profound, terrifying trust of an equal partner. Their eyes met, and the bond of their shared purpose solidified into something deeper, creating a new, prime foundation for the family. If you're standing with Weston and Jax on this journey from broken to whole, subscribe and join our family. Comment where you're watching from. Let's show the world that redemption is real. For once, he wasn't thinking like a boss, but like a man about to lose everything. Months later, the day of the adoption hearing arrived. Jax was almost fully recovered, his brace replaced with a simple, supporting shoe, his eyes bright with newfound confidence. As the proceedings began, a last, desperate attempt at sabotage appeared. Dustin Price, Jax's biological father, clean but haggard, materialized, trying to reclaim Jax purely for the expected financial settlement. The attorney for Price spoke of natural rights, but all eyes turned to Jax. The judge, recognizing the boy's unusual intellect, asked him directly where he belonged. Jax, standing beside Weston, looked at his biological father, the man who saw his disability as a burden, and then turned back to the man who saw his potential. He chose Weston, but the words were for the man he was afraid to lose. He stepped close, whispering urgently against Weston's waist. "I'm not going back, right? You promised you're not going anywhere." Weston gently took the boy's small face in his hands, his eyes conveying a power beyond his criminal empire. "Never, Jax. Never again." The judge ruled immediately, terminating Price's parental rights and granting the adoption. Weston, Jax, and Juniper walked out of the courthouse together, the small, unconventional family unit now legally, fiercely recognized. Weston looked at Jax, whose life was now grounded in structure, love, and the promise of a future. He remembered Jax's words about numbers. Numbers don't lie. It doesn't change because someone's mad or drunk or decides to leave. Weston finally understood. The strongest foundation was not built on blood or loyalty, but on choice and an unbreakable commitment, a bond that, like a prime number, could only divide by itself, whole and completely sufficient. If this story touched your heart, if you believe in second chances and families built on choice rather than blood, subscribe right now. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from and share this with someone who needs to believe that broken things can become whole. We're building something beautiful here. Join us.